Welcome to the webinar on the hero's journey. I'm Richard Bainan and my co-host is Michelle Rowe. Do we need to introduce ourselves? I don't think so. We're both writers. We both have written and do write for television. Mish writes detective novels as well. And we run a course on the hero's journey. But this is not a commercial for that course, although inevitably we will mention the course and we will draw on our understanding of the hero's journey from the work we've done for that course. So let me just launch straight in. Joseph Campbell was an American student of myth, and he wrote a famous book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which was based on his lifelong research. He discovered, or he concluded, that over the history of humanity, a single story form with familiar types of characters and symbols and relationships emerged over and over again, wherever the stories came from, whether they came from the Far East, from the Pacific Islands, from Siberia, from North America. This hero quest he called the Monomyth. So it's the single pattern of stories that underlie all stories. Writers call it the hero's journey. Its grand title, right, The Hero's Journey, refers really to the myths that it sprang from, the ancient tales of Troy and Greece, of Odyssey and the Iliad and Gilgamesh and so on. Those are stories full of tragedy and comedy and sudden turns of fortune. They're about daring quests and dangerous adventures that bring their characters to the very edge of life and death, and sometimes beyond that boundary. And even if you've never read them, you'll have absorbed echoes of them in countless movies and books and plays. So stories of heroism, be them the quiet heroism of ordinary people, or stirring quests of kings or queens or warriors, of conflict, of death, of love, of hate, of fear, of laughter, hold us in thrall. The fact that this hero's quest, this monomyth, finds itself presenting itself to us in the most modern forms is attested to by the new Netflix movie, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which I watched the other night. So it's arguable that these stories serve as maps for our journey through life. Sharing in the lives of characters who battle odds and win or lose is a way in which we understand ourselves and the world and prepare ourselves for our individual heroes' journeys. Mish.
Thanks, Richard, and welcome everybody. It's great to see such a good turnout tonight. And I hope that what we share with you can be useful to you in your writing practice. As Richard says, this journey, the hero's journey, is based on these very ancient and universal ideas. And it's been gaining increasing currency with contemporary screenwriters, novelists, playwrights, even game designers are adopting it because they find that this fluid creative structure is easy to update and easy to innovate. And audiences and readers of today respond to these quite mythic stories, even if, as Richard said, they're actually quite small tales like family stories or even romances. This archetypal hero somehow is found in these mythologies of different cultures and countries throughout the course of history. And now as we see more and more international work, particularly in cinema, but also in novels and so on, there's an echo. These ideas are now better known. And at the time that Campbell wrote it, it was immediately popular. And of course, it was kind of the BBC series made these ideas better known. But it was only much later, when it was sort of adopted and popularized by the film and television industry, that it became a model that is in kind of universal usage. And to some extent or another, people always refer to it. So as a writer, it's very useful to just have some idea of what the hero's journey is about. The Hollywood screenwriter, Christopher Vogler, later took Campbell's original 17-stage Monomyth, these storytelling theories, and he created 12 stages of the journey, which he was basically a development executive as well. And he used that model for story and character development directives for his story departments and for his screenwriters. And he found it enormously successful. And now we tend to see that these 12 stages are found in plays, novels, and movies. And it's because it's very flexible. These individual stages can also be used independently of others, and they will work just as well. So they don't have to go in consecutive order. And Vogler points out that, in fact, it's better if we don't follow it too closely, and so that it doesn't become prescriptive. I know when a lot of people ask about the hero's journey, they say, but isn't that prescriptive? Am I not now just following a sort of paint by numbers kind of approach to writing? And it's absolutely not that at all. It's a much deeper interrogation of what story means. It's not really about kind of joining dots. And it's because these individual stages can work independently, you can shift things around. It's just really about the ideas behind each stage. They can be deleted, some of the stages, they can be shuffled about, but they don't lose their power no matter what sort of variation you have. And the hero's journey, it's important to stress, is certainly not just the province of men on our course. It's also the heroine's journey. One of the most famous heroine's journey in movies is, of course, that of Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, which is a kind of classic mythic story. In classical literature, we have Jane Eyre, who embarks on the heroine's journey, probably the most famous example. And later we have people like Clarice Starling in The Silence of the Lambs, in the Robert Harris book, and again in the adapted film. And female characters follow the journey in recent TV series like The Handmaid's Tale and The Queen's Gambit, which you may be more familiar with. And neither is the hero's journey a binary journey. Gay, non-binary, queer, lesbian, and trans characters, the entire spectrum of human identity, make up the dramatic casts of stories. And the journey can be as easily applied to characters like Fraser and Caitlin in We Are Who We Are, or Virginia Woolf's Orlando, or Calliope in Geoffrey Eugenides' Middlesex, for example. So it's best to look at this model as a kind of psycho-spiritual journey to wholeness, which applies to everyone, regardless of their gender or their race or their religion. And it's important to remember that Campbell was a scholar of mythology, whereas we are writers. And it's our job to continually adopt creative and imaginative approaches to these mythological stories that have been passed down to us for centuries. So after that short intro, I hope we didn't go too fast for you, but I'll ask Richard if he can please take us through the different stages of the journey.
Okay, so before I do that, let me just ask those of you who tuned in, I'm not sure what the phrase is, who joined us after my last request, please to identify where you came from in the chat box. And a number of people have logged in. There's the phrase, as subsequent to my request. So I'd appreciate that if you'd do it. Okay, so let me look quickly. These are, in fact, although the language used is all Joseph Campbell's, these are the 12 stages that Vogler reduced Campbell's 17 stages to. There are reasons for that, which we won't go into now. But Vogler's sequence of stages makes all sorts of sense. In Act 1, the hero begins his journey in the ordinary world. He starts from his comfort zone, from whatever he or she is familiar with. And he is then called to adventure. Something happens, someone calls, it could be Gandalf the wizard, it could be a meteorite striking a neighboring state. Something calls him to the adventure. He's confronted with the need to do something, to leave his comfort zone, to leave the everyday world that he knows so well. And of course, stage 3, his tendency is to refuse the call. It's frightening. Bilbo says, no, I don't want to go on an adventure. Bugger off, right? So the hero refuses the adventure. But Campbell points out something or someone then enters the life of the hero. We can call it, he calls it supernatural aid. It doesn't have to be supernatural, but it's the thing or the impulse or the drive that causes the hero to commit himself to the journey. Despite his reluctance, he overcomes his reluctance. In Bilbo's case, of course, it's the stirring tales and songs that the dwarves sing that inspire him. And he thinks, no, I'm going to leave Hobbiton and my warm, comfortable hobbit home and seek the treasure of the dragon, right? Supernatural aid is the stage that Campbell identifies that overcomes the reluctance of the hero. And stage 5, the hero crosses the threshold from the ordinary world, from the everyday world that he knows, into the special world of the journey. And that stage also marks the end of Act 1. So Act 2, of course, is the big act. Act 1 might consume, of any story, a quarter or a fifth of the entire story's length. Act 2 consumes 2/3, 3/4 perhaps, of the entire story's length. It is the act in which complications happen. Campbell calls stage 6 the road of trials. It's where the hero is tested. It's where he undergoes a series of confrontations with enemies. It's where he meets possible allies. It's where he can get confused about enemies that pretend to be allies, shapeshifters. And he will have a series of conflictual experiences, some of which he will succeed in overcoming, and others of which he will be set back. Now, in film terms, we call this stage of the journey the stage of rising and falling action. it's essential to maintain your hold on the attention of your viewer or your reader. Included in this Act 2 is the next stage of Campbell's journey, which he calls In the Belly of the Whale. It's where you have, it's one of those experiences that leads up to the 8th stage, the supreme ordeal. It's not the climax of the story, but it's the stage of the journey where the hero meets his nemesis and is very often defeated. It's where Bilbo finds himself confronted by the dragon, and he is consumed by his own fears. All right, the journey is frequently a journey through one's own, encountering one's own demons. And it's the transformative experience of the journey. Bilbo goes into the mountain relatively naive, and he comes out of the mountain relatively experienced. He's now a burglar. Remember, he was called a burglar. He's now a burglar with an actual burglary under his belt. He's no longer the innocent naif. And he brings from that encounter with his nemesis, from that supreme ordeal, he brings a fresh understanding of himself or the world, which Campbell calls the elixir. And of course, that's the end of Act 2. He's now ready to return to the ordinary world, to the everyday world that he knows. Campbell calls the first stage of this part of the journey the magic flight. He sees light at the end of the tunnel. He doesn't realize that he still has to meet perhaps the most hazardous of all his encounters. He faces, in a stage called the resurrection, he faces a final test where he has to employ all of the skills and fresh understanding that he's gained to finally overcome his enemy. Frequently, as I say, an enemy within. And he returns in the 12th stage to the ordinary world, to his familiar world, as the master of two worlds. As the master, he has conquered his fears, he has conquered his enemy in the special world of the journey, and returned to his home, to his comfort zone. He is the master of that world as well. Okay, so in 10 minutes, we've taken you through what on our course takes 2 months, or 2 months, 8 sessions, right.
Okay. Yeah, I'll come in here, Richard. I just want to say that, the way that Richard has described it using the Lord of the Rings as his kind of model to take us through, and the names of the different stages of the journey seem to suggest these thrilling, even epic or supernatural events. And of course, the mythic structure of the hero's journey lends itself very well to those sorts of stories. And thus why it was adopted by Hollywood with such relish. But this model can actually apply to just about any story. I would say actually any story, and that includes memoirs, it includes non-fiction narrative as well, because whether it's a coming of age story or a love story or a domestic drama, it's still, these 12 modules still really service your story and your characters in quite a deep and profound way. And I mean, we will get into that. As Richard said, he had to very quickly gloss through, but each one of those stages actually involved a tremendous amount of contemplation and thought and application. And there's really not a model that I have really ever seen or read or analyzed, even when reading other people's work, that we have not found echoes of this journey. So just to make that clear, that if you're writing a very small domestic drama, it applies just as well as a very big epic story like Lord of the Rings. Now, Richard also pointed out that structurally, the journey is broken into Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. So this is the classic structure of all stories as we know it. Having also its roots in the ancient world, in this case, the Poetics of Aristotle, which breaks down that dramatic form. And those 3 acts then correspond with a beginning, a middle, and an end. So to put it in another way, the beginning is your introduction to your characters and your entry to the new world of your characters and the story. The middle is where the story plays out. So it's an exploration of all the conflicts that you have established. And the end is the resolution of that conflict. Bearing in mind that all story, no matter what you're writing, centers around conflict, around human conflict. So whether that's conflict in a family, or it's conflict between 2 superheroes, or whatever it is, it's the essence of drama. Drama means the clash of the protagonist to the antagonist. So the breaking down of those 3 acts is all very commonsensical when you think about it as just a beginning, a middle, and an end. And we take those different modules and we analyze them within those acts.
Yeah, we do that, of course, in our course. Now, we said that this is not a commercial, but we can't help but mention it from time to time. What I wanted to say, really, and I think I'm going to say, probably expand on this when I answer one of the questions that was sent in, is that the hero's journey is not so much it's certainly not a prescriptive device. It's more a provocation, I think. But in order to understand it in depth, and it really is, as Mesh says, worth studying in depth, we do that across 8 sessions of our course, but I don't want to go there. All right, should we start with our questions, with the questions that were sent in? The first is from Karen Brynard. Not sure how I pronounce your surname. Mesh, you're going to answer that because you have a history of crime.
I'm a criminal.
Yeah.
I have a history of being a criminal. Okay, so this is from Karen Brynard, who you probably know if you know anything about nice, juicy crime writing. She's a crime writer, a published South African crime writer, has done very well. So welcome, Karen. It's lovely to have you here. And her question is, could you share ideas on the hero's journey and crime novels? If the hero was a police detective, how could his journey be developed? Okay, so this is a good question in the sense that it's asking about genre, and could something like the hero's journey actually apply to a kind of a cop story? And of course it applies brilliantly and works brilliantly well. Even though it makes no difference what your character does for a living in terms of the journey, whether she's a cop or a post office worker or a petty thief, but the same dramatic rules will apply and apply across all writing, of course. And those rules are that the character must have, whether they are aware of it in the beginning or not, a dream or a goal. A police detective has a very clear and obvious goal just built in by the genre. You know, if you're reading a detective story, that you're going to be taken on a journey which is around the solving of a criminal case. But if we were to take that sort of genre story into the hero's journey, we would interrogate that in a much deeper way. So Campbell would maybe suggest that the point of any story is that a protagonist or a hero has some unrealized part of themselves, a need to complete themselves, a need to find their true mission in life, which would be a higher purpose, beyond the apparent goal that is being introduced in the story's plot, let's say. But the character fears facing up to this responsibility and that mission, which is really to achieve wholeness or personal actualization. So you, as the writer and the creator of the hero, must know what that weakness or fatal flaw is, even if your hero is completely unaware of it. Because as we know, there are very few actually original plots or human dilemmas. I mean, stories are only original in the way that they're told rather than what the stories are. And a hero's journey is not genre specific. It can relate to any story, any genre, a romance, for example, as I said before. The key to writing a potent story is to make your story universal. And I think that the hero's journey really understands that. For example, one of the characters that we use in our course is an alcoholic detective who's been framed for corruption. He's just an example that we use when we go through certain aspects of the course. He's been suspended and a trial date has been set. He realizes the only way he can prove his innocence and restore his reputation is by unearthing the real culprit before his case is heard. So that's his outer goal. That's what we would call a plot. But what is his inner goal? And we find that out by looking at what he runs away from. What is his greatest fear? So say his worst fear is being found guilty and sentenced, which will destroy his relationship with his young son, who hero worships him. So what does this tell us about our hero if that is his greatest fear? It tells us he's profoundly afraid that he is unlovable if he shows any form of weakness or especially moral weakness. He believes he's only worthy of love if he's strong and a hero. In other words, what he carries as a character is a false self. And the hero's journey is for him to fight that fear. So as a writer, we would put him in an extremis of powerlessness and moral weakness. We will batter him with his fears. We'll make his flaw apparent to himself so that he can assimilate it and then live out this duality. And only then can he achieve some sort of wholeness and thus an authentic relationship with his son. So now I'm putting this very boldly because we obviously go into it in a lot more depth. But that is the way we would actually approach the story. Very much character driven and very much about the inner journey of the character. Rish, would you like to, there's another question here, would you like to answer that one?
Sure. Refilwe said that she's interested in doing our course, but at firstly it seems a big investment, and secondly, I'm not sure it's right for me at this stage of my novel. I only have a vague idea of the story. Will it help me develop my idea? Well, Refilwe, frankly, the very best time to think of the hero's journey is when you are first formulating your story. I hesitate to say apply the hero's journey to your story because it's not that kind of formula, as we've been saying. It is, as I said a minute ago, more like a provocation. The journey and the archetypes that Campbell analyzed are prompts, or they can be used as prompts. Have you thought of your antagonist in sufficient detail? Have you given your hero the agency that properly belongs to the hero? Is the adventure, in the sense that every novel is about an adventure of one sort or another, is it too easily embarked upon? You know, that reluctance of the hero plays a very important role in creating suspense in a story. So yes, it's the hero's journey, but it's also the dramatic journey that we're talking about. And the hero's journey points you in the direction of asking questions that help you define your drama. How is your hero transformed? Because in every story, in some way or other, the experiences that the hero undergoes transforms him. I mean, in the classic tale, the hero dies and a new hero is born. Anyway, there are 100 questions that the hero's journey will prompt you to ask of your story. And at the beginning, in my view, is a great time to ask those questions. So if you think of the hero's journey as a series of questions that in all probability you ask yourself as you embark on the singular adventure of writing a novel, questions that lead you to psychologically and dramatically astute decisions. That's where the hero's journey, in my view, is unparalleled in its usefulness.
Thanks, Richard.
So that's my answer to that.
Great, thank you. There's another question here. It's from Lynn Joffe, also another very good published writer. And she's asked, what is your take on the heroine's journey versus the hero's journey? Campbell was dismissive, if not condescending, about his take on the feminine. I've written a novel in the guise of a satirical heroine's journey. Maureen Murdoch brought this debate into the light. How do you think it affects the hero's journey overall? Okay, so this is an interesting question, Lynn. I mean, I just want to need to give some sort of background to those who may not have heard of Maureen Murdoch. She was a student of Campbell's and a psychotherapist, a Jungian psychotherapist. And she published a book called The Heroine's Journey, A Woman's Quest for Wholeness, which is sort of a self-help book for women and was largely in response to Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces, the model as well, that the kind of, what he was espousing, his kind of theory, she challenged it with this kind of feeling that the feminine was not addressed and feeling that this journey had been designed specifically for men. So I just need to elaborate on that a little bit. I think it's important, it's very important to recognize that Campbell's investment in masculinity was very much of the time that he wrote it. And since then, we've obviously seen a slow reevaluation of the feminine in popular culture. I think Murdoch started valuable work in relooking at this model, as have many other writers. And there's a plethora of literature on the subject of the goddess and the wounded woman and so on. But a lot of these models, and Murdoch's particularly, is a therapeutic model. And for me, this really does not sustain itself as a dramatic one on close reading. And it's quite reductionist in a sense for what I will elaborate further on. Because I don't think that we should conflate therapy and therapeutic journeys with literature or drama. Although we certainly have, psychology has certainly affected the way that we look at writing. And certainly writing also has the ability to bring an emotional or psychological catharsis. But we must never lose sight that the primary function of literature and film and so on is to entertain. So I must argue rather vociferously against this idea that there was a suppression of the feminine, because I don't think that the hero's journey was ever really seen as something that's, or can be seen specifically now, something that is gender specific at all. And in fact, I would say the idea that there was a suppression of the feminine may apply in many other areas of of women's lives. But when it comes to literature, I think we must not go there, because I think that risks selling the whole canon of women writers very short indeed. Because although women have lacked agency politically and economically, when it comes to writing, they certainly have not. I mean, I think women have forged their whole personal and political identity through the form of the novel. I mean, Mary Wollstonecraft is the obvious one. I mean, she wrote novels apart from the Vindication of the Rights of Women. And of course, her daughter, Mary Shelley, with Frankenstein. It was a seminal work for women. And for centuries, novels are considered to be largely written by women for women, as it's work that you did within the kind of domestic sphere. I mean, Jane Austen is a case in point. But no one can say that those novels were not heroes' journeys. I mean, Jane is arguably the most famous heroine's journey in classic literature, as is Dorothea in Middlemarch. So I think we must just be careful of conflating a psychotherapeutic model with a dramatic model, which is what, in a way, that our adaptation of this course is about. And even in movies, I mean, women embarked on heroes' journeys long before Dorothy was in The Wizard of Oz. Like in the 1940s, in particular, there were very strong woman characters and stories that really dominated Hollywood. I mean, there was a powerhouse of women talent in Hollywood in the 40s. So I think we must be cautious about maybe adopting a historical or reductionist sort of approach to Campbell's work, because Murdoch wrote, if I'm not wrong, I think she wrote The Heroine's Journey in 1990, I think, which is like 30 years ago. And it's already dated for all the reasons that I mentioned in the intro, because gender is less fixed, it's much more fluid and flexible. And as a result, there's been this very big shift in the kind of characters and stories that people want to read or watch now. And certainly in our course, we apply the hero's journey principles to whatever the writers bring to us. And that very much includes queer, non-binary, and trans, as well as straight characters. So I would say that the hero's journey, I think that it's true, the course, and it's true to Campbell in that the hero's journey is essentially a journey into wholeness. And this requires a balance of both feminine and masculine energies and values in our characters and our stories. And it doesn't matter the gender identification of the character. I think the principles still hold and are very strong. Thank you.
Thanks, Mish. Sylvia asked, she says, I have bought a copy of The Hero with 1,000 Faces, but to be honest, it's a daunting read and it doesn't offer practical advice for writers. What are your down and dirty tips for applying the hero's journey to a story? All right, so I think that we've more or less answered that by saying you don't really apply the hero's journey to a story. In fact, after Star Wars, which did apply the hero's journey to that story, Hollywood and Christopher Vogler published his book. Hollywood did take to it with unbridled enthusiasm and churned out movie after movie after movie, obviously not all, and certainly not the best movies, that followed the pattern slavishly and took the hero's journey as the key to, box office. And so the hero's journey became a bit of a cliche, and there are people who disparage it and dismiss it as being a useful tool for writers, simply because it was misapplied. It was seen as prescriptive. It was making story by numbers, and it had become a cliche. But if you regard it as a provocation and not as a blueprint, I think you will find that it is fantastically useful to any writer. That's my answer. I don't think I need to say more about that.
I have a question here from Mari van Veek. And she says, although I'm intrigued by the hero's journey, I'm uncertain about how useful it is for someone trying to write a beautiful lyrical story. It seems very prescriptive. How can I use it in a more gentle way? So Mari, I think we have addressed this largely through what we've spoken about earlier. But I just want to stress again for everyone who's watching is this is really not a prescriptive model. And in the course, we really treat each stage as what it is, which is the journey of a character in the world and into herself. And all the stages are fascinating in and of themselves. And I think it just leads readers and writers and filmmakers into this kind of deeper engagement with their work. And certainly the lyrical story can only benefit. I mean, all the stages are fascinating in themselves. And if you want to realize that even the most poetic prose in the world does not necessarily make a story requires a kind of momentum and a kind of underlying structure. And in a way, I always think of beautiful lyrical prose as kind of the icing on top of a delicious cake. It's like the final delicious thing that tempts us to, want to explore the cake. But at the base of that, there has to be this quite solid foundation. So when people say, oh, well, I'm writing something lyrical and poetic, and I don't know how this would apply, I always think, yes, the writing is one thing. When you're writing a book or a story or a screenplay, the language is almost, in some ways, the least important part of it. Because language is a way to convey ideas and to convey character and to convey a story. It's really a vehicle. And to get the actual structure of what you're doing, what we call the heavy lifting of a story in place, there's a lot of quite deep engagement that has to go on first. So I would just say that, I mean, not to, I don't know what your story is about and how far you are or anything, but I do think that it is an incredibly useful tool. And it's sort of, the principles will always apply in this, even the smallest story, as I said. But because every life experience is actually a story that engages with the self. It's every story we write is kind of engaging with ourselves on a specific kind of level. So I hope that answers your question. I went a bit off track there, but yeah.
Natasha Porser has asked a complex series of questions, which are interesting. They're not altogether about the hero's journey, but we don't mind because they're about writing, and that's always interesting. So let me just read them one at a time. She starts off by saying, what research methods do you utilize as a writer to ensure the story is as authentic as possible? She says, i.e. place or profession, background or details. Well, the one piece of research that we kind of take for granted, but that we shouldn't, is the research that has taken us a lifetime to conduct. And that is the research into ourselves and the research into people we know and love or know and hate, but know. And that research, which lies at the basis of every worthwhile novel, is not about the details of the engineering details. It's not about the technical exactitude of the world that you've created. It's about an understanding of human beings. So let's not forget that to begin with. Do that. And you do that by observing and listening and thinking and reading and more of the same, rinse and repeat. I thought that I'd actually ask you, Mesh, because in your novels, your crime novels, you had to do a great deal of very specific research to get it sounding authentic. And the question that I'd like to ask you in answering that quite briefly, because we're going to run out of time, is what is too much research?
You know, Richard, I also worked for a long time as a researcher in movies. And the problem with research is it's sort of addictive, and it's quite a lot of fun because it means you don't have to start writing your book or your screenplay because you're so caught up in the research. Research is so exciting. It's so interesting. And, you know, you don't have to do the hard work of writing because you can just carry on finding out new stuff. It's thrilling. It's amazing. All these ideas are going around, you know, oh, I've got to do more research and more research. You can spend, you know, months. And I think I've come to the horrible conclusion that maybe one should not do research before one begins a book, because I've found that in many times with screenplays or books, the research actually starts to get in the way. And a story is not research, as you said. It actually isn't. I mean, the story is about moving people. It's about moving someone emotionally along a kind of, you know, a trajectory. And if you, the research can sort of muddy that and make you forget that you've got, you know, you're actually writing a story. And then you start trying to fit it all in, and there's this obsession with being authentic and making sure you've got the right things in the right places and so on. It can become very wooden. So I think people are different. Some people do very small amounts of research and then they start writing and it all works well. But I found that for me, research is an incredible temptation to just sit online all day long, plowing through endless websites, sitting in libraries, going to interview hundreds of people and thinking I'm writing, you know.
Yeah.
But I'm not, of course, because the writing is boring. It's like sitting with your bum on a seat and just, you know, clacking it out.
Okay, that's great. I
I
agree with you. I mean, in the end, in fact, that you can always add in a couple of details. If you want to persuade somebody that somebody really is a brain surgeon, actually, you don't have to describe him operating on somebody's brain. A couple of phrases that he uses, as long as they're the right ones, will be enough to establish him as an eminent brain surgeon. Right?
Right.
You need very little.
I agree. And very often one finds that one's then just excising that material out of one's book painfully, and you're back to where you should have been in the beginning. Like concentrating on your story. And I also think another thing about research is that you can write something. I mean, I'm thinking of that Ian McEwan book where it actually is about a brain surgeon. I've forgotten the book now, but in it you go through a brain operation in extraordinary detail, and it's very well evoked. But what makes it powerful is, okay, it's got all the facts and figures at his fingertips, but it's the experience of the character going through this process that makes it so strong. You can always fill in the bits that you've got wrong or you don't know, or what year was that, what street was that, you know. So I think you've got to trust yourself a lot more when you write and lean a lot more on what the story is you're trying to tell, because that usually comes from inside you and not from outside.
Okay, next question. I think you agreed to look at that one.
Okay, so the next question is, which works better, just writing and letting the story take you places, Or do you advise plotting out the chapters first? Okay, this is quite a common question. And I suppose, in a way, the hero's journey has, I think, taught us quite a lot about this, Richard, wouldn't you say? Because I think, because this is a sort of common question. We get this at every webinar that we do and on every course we do. And I think it's a sort of, it's not really understanding what a story is, that question, because these are the story, like, what is a plot? A plot is A to B to C to D. So it's A happened, then B happened, and that caused C to happen, and that then resolved itself into D. That is actually what a plot is. So when you look at a story, what you're really looking at is like, how does a character, how does a person, how does a human being react to certain circumstances that are happening to them at some given moment? And we're reducing it. You know, a story is a reduced idea, because there's so many stories and there's so much going on. And now we're basically cutting out all the time. The more we write, the less potential there is in the story, if you know what I mean. As you go along, you're cutting out masses and masses of stuff, because you can only tell a singular idea. And I find that if you're a person who likes to plot on pieces of board or on library cards, that's great. Or if you're a person who just likes to sit down and write, and then try and make sense of the mess later, I don't think it matters at all. As long as one has a sense of, I'm making choices here, like every single thing I write is a choice of what I'm leaving out. And in terms of things like, that's what we've learned about the hero's journey as well, is that the character does have to go through a very specific type of journey if it's going to touch people. And that's a human experience. It's a human challenge, which we all have, which is to find ourselves. You know, who are we? Why are we here? All the big questions. And even though you might not have that in your book in an obvious way, you as the writer have to know those things about your character. What would you say, Richard?
I would say that I got in the post today the latest issue of the London Review of Books. And there's a review of a new book about D.H. Lawrence. And it touches on this very question. Apparently, Lawrence despised writers who planned their stories. I'll read you a passage from the essay. He loathed novelists like Flaubert, whom he conceived to be control freaks and whose books were carefully plotted and arranged developments. He said, quite lacking the crucial quality he called unexpectedness. He wrote to a friend, this is Lawrence, wrote to his own friend, he said, I am doing a novel which I have never grasped. Damn its eyes. There I am at page 145, and I have no notion of what it's about. Okay, so I don't know if that novel was ever published, perhaps not. But I wanted to say that actually there's a range also of writers. And writers write in every kind of way. Some of them pretend not to know what they're writing about. I suspect that that was D.H. Lawrence. I know that Ian Rankin said at a speech that I listened to years ago that he never knows who committed the crime when he starts writing his books, and that he is led to that by the characters. And I think, well, maybe so, maybe not. So I think the question is really not that relevant, because you will write in the way that suits your personality, but you will also have to write in a way that suits the dramatic demands of story, which is what Mish has been saying. Okay, your next question was, I'm deeply aware of the fact that we have 4 minutes left. Is it possible to write in more than one genre, or would this be difficult? Well, interestingly, crossing genres is something that writers have been doing possibly from the beginning, but increasingly these days. You can even spot them in the subgenres that have appeared: the erotic thriller, the sci-fi western, the sci-fi detective stories. And it's at the intersection of genres that new ideas occur to you. So it can be difficult, of course, and it can be awkward in a clumsy writer's hands. But I would always suggest that somebody thinking of a story to begin with should think cross genres. It can be very productive. Sorry, short answer. Your next question was, do you self-publish or find a publisher? We could hold a webinar about that,
Yeah,
right?
that's a very long and quite complicated answer. I mean, I think you could do either. I think now there's so many ways to get work out into the world that I think it's almost a bit of a non-question in a way. I don't know what you think, Richard, because
well, let's just remember there's a big trade-off.
Yeah.
If you get a conventional publisher, you enjoy a tiny fraction of the royalties. If you self-publish, you enjoy a much larger fraction, but you have to do the promotion. And Mish and I have a friend who's written a number of successful novels. He spends a couple of hours every single night promoting his ebooks. So if you're up for that, then self-publication is.
Yeah, I think it's a very much, I think it's so much depends on the publisher, because you can get a publisher who really works hard for you, and then you can get publishers who just do nothing for you at all. And then you can self-publish and it will just, can take off, but I think publishing generally is just a very difficult business, and there's no guarantees with it. And it's kind of luck in a funny way. Like, can you find the right publisher at exactly the right time for that book, and so on. So I think one should you should always keep publishing in mind, because you're writing for an audience, but I don't think you should start off thinking about that. I think write the book.
Yes, write the book.
Write the book. Which brings us to our next question. Do you want to take that one, Rish, about how to start the process of writing a book and what are the first steps and so on? I think these are things we have covered in many other. I'm not sure if that really is.
Yeah. I think that let's move on to the next question, which is Maria Kamazanios's question. Her question is, how do you make a character that already exists likable enough for the reader? I'm
not really sure what
Can I just speculate and answer it at the same time? I'm assuming that you're saying, if I am using a real person as a character in a book, then do I not have to stick with the real person? Can I make that real person do things that in real life he or she might not have done? To what extent do you have liberty to play with the life of somebody real? And I think that you've got absolute liberty to do that, because bear in mind this cardinal fact, that fictional characters and real characters on the page have to be created with all the attention to detail and psychological realism and so on. There's no difference between real and fictional characters on the page. You are creating characters, whether or not your character is called Boris Johnson or Vladimir Putin. You still have to create the character, just as you would have to create a character who is entirely imaginary.
Maria's added information in the chat.
Maria has added information in her chat, in the chat. She said, for example, I'm combining the characters from Dracula and putting them in Jane Eyre. Yeah, absolutely, Maria. Go wild. I think people will recognize that that is part of the game of writing fiction, is to imagine these things. And I think that's wonderful. Don't feel inhibited by what the original writers did with those characters. Mish, do you agree?
I agree. And I really love those kind of taking characters from books and putting them in different settings, or letting them meet other imaginary or literary characters. I think it's a great device, and it's fun, and it's fun to read as well, because there's always like little clues, and you kind of in on the joke, and it's very intertextual. So there's always a sense that, you know, you, in a way, you're kind of inviting your reader to see the little in jokes and see the sort of games that you're playing, the literary games you're playing. And I mean, it can be very entertaining. So yeah, I would go for it.
Go for it.
Fun.
Okay, we have shot our bolt. It's 3 minutes past the hour.
Okay.
I just want to give you a tiny detail about the Next Hero's Journey course, which begins on the 21st of October. It consists of 8 sessions. Material is sent to you in advance, but we meet on Zoom in order to give feedback to exercises that you write in real time. So that's the 8-session series that begins on the 21st of October. We have another one that begins in January. In October, we've only got 2 places left. We keep the classes small because we do give live feedback, and we can't do that with lots of people. It's a fantastic course, guys. And I only say that with such conviction because we've been told that by virtually every single person who's done the course. It's an exciting course that Mish and I enjoy conducting. We love it, and everyone who's done it loves it as well. So do sign up.
It's very interactive because we've got a lot of film. We cover film in quite a lot of detail as well as literature. So there's lots of film clips, there's scripts, there's short stories, there's excerpts from writing. It's very rich. I mean, I'm enthusing here as well, but really, Richard and I developed it because on one of our other courses, we introduced the hero's journey as a model, but only it's a short part of the course. And people loved that section so much that they actually asked us to develop this course for writers, which we did. We've done it maybe twice up to now. Hey, Richard? 2 or 3 times. And it's been incredibly successful. And I mean, I really would encourage you not to do a big switch and bait story here, or bait and switch, whatever it's called. But
and the course has been endorsed by the Joseph Campbell Foundation. So yes, that's no mean thing either, I have to say.
And I think one of the, if I'm not wrong, I think that one of the people from the foundation will be sitting in on parts of the course, which will be quite interesting. Yeah. So yes, so if any of you feel like going on really on a kind of change your writing journey, I mean, I would really like to meet some of you on that course. And it's been great having you all here. It's great to see so many people who are interested in the subject. It's wonderful, actually. And so many people who are obviously out there writing and interested in writing. So yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. And good night, everyone.